The morning it started looked exactly like every other morning I'd ever had on that land. The sun was just coming up over the fence line, the grass still dark with dew, and the pasture was quiet in that way only working land ever gets quiet. Never empty, never still, just waiting. I was halfway through my usual routine, checking water, counting heads, listening to the low, steady sounds that tell you everything is normal, when I heard something that didn't belong there. Not birds, not cattle, engines, heavy ones, the kind that don't idle unless they're about to change something permanently. I crested the small rise near the south fence and saw them. Trucks lined up along the edge of my pasture, men in reflective vests unloading equipment, survey stakes already planted in the ground like they'd been there for days, and right in the middle of my grazing land, my pasture, someone had spray-painted bright orange lines carving a path through grass that had never been anything but grass. That was the first moment I realized what they thought this place was. To them, this wasn't land that worked. It wasn't land that fed animals, paid taxes, or carried 3 generations of memory. To them, it was empty, decorative, something you look at from a distance and improve once you're bored enough. They thought pasture meant unused. From their perspective, I can almost see how the mistake happened. You drive past a stretch of open land every day, bordered by new houses with perfect lawns and identical mailboxes, and you stop seeing it as something alive. You start seeing it as a gap, a blank space between subdivisions, something temporary, something that hasn't caught up yet. But that pasture wasn't waiting for anything. It was already doing its job every single day, whether anyone noticed or not. I grew up learning that job, before there were cul-de-sacs and street lamps, before anyone had ever used the phrase mixed-use development out here. This land fed cattle. It still does. Every morning the routine is the same. Check the fences, check the water, walk the pasture, watch how the herd moves. You learn quickly that cattle don't move randomly. They follow patterns, shade in the afternoon, water mid-morning, grazing lanes they've worn into the ground over years. That empty field had more structure and purpose than any HOA meeting agenda ever would. The construction crew didn't ask me anything that morning. They didn't knock on my door. They didn't wave. They acted like they were exactly where they were supposed to be, confident, comfortable, as if the question of permission had already been settled somewhere far away, on paper, in a room I'd never been invited into, and that confidence was what made my stomach sink more than the equipment itself. Because people don't pour concrete by accident. They don't bring crews and permits and machinery unless they believe they've already won. I walked down to the fence line and asked the foreman what they were doing. He looked at his clipboard, not at me, and said they were starting work on a community bike path. He said it casually, like he was explaining the weather. When I told him this was active cattle land, he shrugged and said, "We've got the paperwork." That sentence, short, dismissive, final, was the moment the entire situation changed. Not because it answered anything, but because it revealed everything about how they saw this place and how little they understood what they were stepping into. Paper doesn't feed animals. Paper doesn't hold fences together. Paper doesn't move a herd when the weather turns. But somewhere along the way, someone had decided that paper mattered more than reality. That if a document said easement, then decades of daily use stopped counting. That a line on a map could override hoof paths worn into the ground long before anyone here knew what a homeowners association even was. As I stood there watching them unload bags of concrete, I thought about how many mornings I'd walked that same stretch of land with my wife, about how she used to tease me for counting the cattle out loud, like they might forget who they were if I didn't, about how this pasture wasn't just where the animals grazed, but where we planned futures, solved problems, and found quiet after long days. Losing her had already changed everything about how that land felt to me. But seeing strangers treated like a design problem, like a blank canvas for their amenities, added a different kind of weight. It felt like someone erasing a language they'd never bothered to learn. They'd designed the bike path to cut straight through the center of the pasture, the most efficient route on paper, a gentle curve for cyclists, wide enough for strollers, clean lines. What the plan didn't show were the water troughs that would suddenly sit on opposite sides of a concrete barrier, the gates that would no longer make sense, the way cattle bunch and move when startled, The fact that animals don't understand signage or shared use rules. The plan assumed cooperation from things that cannot cooperate by design. That assumption, quiet, arrogant, and incredibly common, was the real conflict, not noise complaints, not aesthetics, not progress versus tradition. It was the belief that rural land is passive, that it exists to be reshaped by whoever shows up last with the most paperwork. And standing there that morning, I realized that belief was about to run headfirst into something it couldn't negotiate with. I told the foreman again that this land was in use, that they needed to stop until things were clarified. He said he'd call his supervisor. The supervisor never came. Instead, the work continued, just far enough to make it clear they weren't taking me seriously. A few more stakes, a few more measurements, just enough to test whether I'd escalate or step aside. That's when I understood this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a strategy. Move fast, look official, and let the person who actually lives with the consequences be the one who has to prove they matter. As the equipment rumbled to life, cattle began drifting closer, curious about the noise. That's when the contrast became impossible to ignore. On one side, men preparing to pour concrete for recreation. On the other, animals that rely on this space for food and safety. And in the middle, a belief that these two things could coexist simply because someone wanted them to. The people who approved this plan had never stood where I was standing. They'd never watched 1,000 pounds of muscle decide to bolt because something unfamiliar moved the wrong way. They'd never been responsible for what happens when routines break. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I didn't do anything dramatic. I took photos. I wrote down names. I noted times. Because at that moment, it became clear that the only way to stop this wasn't emotion, it was evidence. If they were going to pretend this pasture was empty, I was going to show exactly how full it really was. Full of use, full of responsibility, full of consequences they hadn't considered. By the time I walked back to the house, the orange lines had multiplied. The path was becoming real, inch by inch, assumption by assumption. Somewhere, someone in a meeting room believed this was a small win, a harmless improvement, a box checked on a development plan. They believed resistance would fade once the concrete set. What they didn't realize, what no one pouring that foundation understood, was that you can't build through active land and expect the land to stay quiet. They thought pasture meant empty. What they didn't realize was that this single mistake would stop the entire project. They didn't argue with me about the cattle. They didn't debate safety or logistics or even basic common sense. Instead, they did something far more effective. They handed me paper. A week after the construction crews first showed up, I received a certified letter in the mail. Heavy envelope. Official. Looking seal. The kind of thing that makes your shoulders tense before you even open it. Inside was a notice from the HOA stating that construction was proceeding lawfully and within the scope of a pre-existing easement. Those words were bolded, underlined, and repeated 3 times in the first paragraph alone. It wasn't written to explain anything. It was written to end the conversation. Attached to the letter was a copy of a document they claimed settled the matter completely. A scanned page, yellowed around the edges, allegedly dating back decades. It showed a strip of land crossing my pasture, labeled vaguely, with a paragraph full of dense language and a signature block at the bottom. My name was on it, or at least something that looked like my name. That was the first moment I felt that familiar, sinking feeling a lot of landowners know too well. The feeling that comes when someone tells you they've already decided, and the decision has been laminated. There's a quiet power to paperwork. It doesn't raise its voice, it doesn't threaten, it just sits there and implies that resistance is ignorance, that if you don't immediately comply, you must be the one who doesn't understand how things work. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at that document longer than I'd like to admit, not because I believed it, but because I knew how this usually goes. One person versus an association, one voice versus a stack of forms. I knew neighbors who'd been worn down by less. Fence D. Disputes, access roads, utility lines. Someone always shows up with a map, a date, and a stamp, and suddenly the burden shifts to you to prove your own land is actually yours. The HOA's letter leaned heavily on that imbalance. It referenced county records. It mentioned compliance deadlines. It suggested, politely of course, that continued resistance could result in unnecessary legal exposure. There was nothing explicitly threatening about it. That was the point. It assumed the conclusion and dared me to object from a weaker position. What struck me first wasn't the language, though. It was the date. The easement was supposedly granted in the early 1960s. That alone wasn't impossible. Land changes hands, rights get layered. But the subdivision didn't exist then. Not even close. The road network shown on the attached plat looked familiar, but only in the way old guesses sometimes resemble modern reality. The curves were wrong. The scale was off. It was like someone had drawn the future without quite knowing how it would turn out. I noticed the parcel number didn't match the one on my current deed. That can happen too, over time, with reclassification. But then I noticed something else. The signature. The document claimed it was signed by me, not my grandfather, not a previous owner, me, on a date when I was a child. That was the first red flag that felt less like a mistake and more like an insult. Still, doubt has a way of creeping in when paperwork is involved. You start second-guessing yourself. Maybe it was a different document. Maybe it had been amended. Maybe your memory is wrong. That's what these situations rely on. Not certainty, but hesitation. If you pause long enough, construction continues. Concrete sets. The path becomes permanent and the argument becomes theoretical. I called the number listed on the letter and asked for clarification. The HOA representative spoke calmly, confidently, and vaguely. She repeated that the easement was on record and that their legal counsel had reviewed it. When I pointed out the date issue, she said records from that era were often imprecise. When I mentioned the signature problem, she suggested it might be a clerical carryover. Nothing I said caused concern. Nothing slowed them down. Everything was framed as already settled. That's when I realized the document wasn't meant to convince me. It was meant to discourage, to make me feel isolated, outmatched, and foolish for even questioning it. It was a bluff built on formality. I started making copies, not to distribute but to study. I laid the easement next to my deed, old tax maps, survey records. The more I looked, the more things failed to line up. Measurements that didn't correspond. Terminology that didn't exist at the time it claimed to be written. References to zoning categories that hadn't been established yet. Individually, each inconsistency could be brushed aside. Together, they told a different story. The deadlines bothered. Me too. The letter demanded acknowledgement within 10 days, not response, acknowledgement, as if silence could be interpreted as consent, as if speed mattered more than accuracy. Legitimate agreements don't need urgency decades later. Only fragile ones do. Friends told me not to worry, that it was probably standard procedure, that HOAs always overreach a little. But that reassurance didn't sit right. Overreach still relies on something real. This felt like something else, like a costume worn too confidently. The more pressure they applied, the more I suspected they didn't want anyone slowing down long enough to look closely. I went down to the county records office myself, not to confront anyone, just to see what was actually there. The clerk pulled the file tied to my parcel. The easement wasn't listed, not under my name, not under any previous owner. There were utility easements, access agreements, nothing that resembled what the HOA had sent me. When I mentioned the document, the clerk frowned and said she'd need to see the original filing reference number. The HOA's copy didn't include one. That omission might seem small, but it's the kind of thing that matters. Official documents leave trails, index numbers, recording stamps. This one floated. It existed only as a copy, detached from the system it claimed authority from. I didn't tell the HOA what I'd found. Not yet. Instead, I asked, politely, for the original recording information. Days passed. Construction continued. When they responded, they sent another copy of the same document, this time with a handwritten note claiming the original had been archived under legacy formatting. No number, no stamp, just reassurance. That was when the story shifted in my mind from dispute to deception. Ordinary landowners are trained culturally to respect paper. We're told it's the final word, that if something is written down, someone else has already checked it. But the truth is, paper only carries authority when it's anchored to reality. And this document wasn't anchored to anything. It was floating on confidence alone. The more I pressed for specifics, the more evasive the responses became. Conversations redirected, emails answered with generalities. The HOA kept repeating the same phrase, long-standing agreement. But longevity without evidence is just repetition. One afternoon, I noticed something that finally made everything click. The font. It sounds ridiculous, but it mattered. The document claimed to be from the early 1960s, yet the typeface was modern. Not obviously so unless you've spent years around records, but unmistakable once you see it. Fonts evolve, formatting evolves. This one belonged to an era that knew how to scan and email. That was the moment the unease turned into certainty. This wasn't a misunderstood agreement. It wasn't a clerical error. It wasn't a gray area. It was a manufactured justification designed to look old enough to be unquestionable and vague enough to intimidate. The paper wasn't clarifying rights. It was inventing them. Still, I didn't confront them with that realization, because at this stage, confrontation would only trigger denial. The goal wasn't to argue, it was to expose. And exposure requires patience. So I let them believe the document was working. I let them think I was stalled, confused, overwhelmed. Meanwhile, I documented everything. Every version of the paper they sent. Every inconsistency. Every rushed deadline. Every time they referenced authority without producing proof. They believed the weight of the document was enough. That paper, once presented, would end resistance. They didn't realize the opposite was happening. Every time they leaned on that easement, they revealed how little substance it had. That document wasn't just wrong, it wasn't real. And once that truth came into the open, nothing built on it could stand. There's a certain fantasy people have about open land. They imagine it as calm, gentle, forgiving, a place where nothing really happens unless someone decides it should. They picture slow movement, predictable behavior, and animals that politely keep their distance. That fantasy is what turns working land into a backdrop instead of a system, and that's exactly where this situation began to break down. Cattle don't recognize HOA boundaries. They don't know what a subdivision is. They don't understand the idea of shared use paths or recreational access. They respond to sound, movement, weather, and instinct. That's not a flaw. It's the entire point of raising them properly. A pasture isn't an exhibit. It's an environment designed around patterns that have worked for generations. When you disrupt those patterns, you don't get compromise. You get unpredictability. I tried to explain this early on, calmly and clearly, because I knew how this would look from the outside. A man saying no to a bike path can be framed as stubborn, as old-fashioned, as resistant to change. I didn't want it to become that kind of story. So I kept my language practical. I talked about gates, grazing routes, water access. I talked about daily movement and seasonal shifts. I talked about responsibility, because when you own livestock, responsibility isn't optional. If something goes wrong, it's on you. If an animal is startled by an unfamiliar noise or presence and reacts in a way that causes harm, no sign explaining shared space makes that go away. Liability doesn't care about intentions, it cares about outcomes. And anyone who understands working land knows that you don't introduce uncontrolled foot traffic into an active pasture and hope it works out. What the HOA saw as an amenity, I saw as a constant variable. Cyclists moving at different speeds. Children darting ahead of parents, dogs on leashes or not, headphones blocking awareness, all of it intersecting with animals that weigh hundreds, sometimes over 1,000 pounds, and rely on herd cues to decide when to move. Even calm cattle can spook. Even well-managed land has moments you can't predict. I remember one meeting where someone said, "The cows will get used to it." Not unkindly, not maliciously, just confidently. That sentence alone told me everything about the gap we were dealing with. Animals don't get used to inconsistency, they adapt to routine. A bike path introduces randomness, some days quiet, some days crowded, some days loud, some days fast. There's no pattern for an animal to settle into. I asked them a simple question. Who would be responsible if someone wandered off the path and startled the herd? No one answered directly. They talked about signage, about fencing options, about insurance riders, all downstream solutions to a problem that shouldn't exist in the first place. You don't build safety plans around a flawed assumption. You stop and reconsider the assumption. This wasn't about stubbornness, it was about safety. The irony was that I was the one thinking about the people using the path, not just the cattle. I knew how quickly a calm scene can turn chaotic when an animal reacts to something unexpected. A dropped helmet, a sudden shout, a dog pulling free. These aren't extreme scenarios, they're normal human moments, and normal human moments don't belong inside an active livestock environment. I walked the proposed route myself, imagining it not as a line on a map, but as a real place occupied by real bodies. I pictured where the herd tends to gather during heat, where they cross naturally when moving between grazing areas, where visibility drops near the tree line. The path cut through all of it, ignoring the logic the land itself had established over time. To the HOA, the pasture was underutilized space. To me, it was already full of movement patterns, hierarchies, instincts and responsibilities, full of decisions made every day to keep animals healthy and people safe. You can't overlay recreation on top of that and expect harmony simply because you want it. I noticed something else as the conversations continued. The HOA spoke about safety as a checklist, railings, warning signs, rules. I spoke about safety as an outcome, an environment designed so problems don't arise in the first place. Those are two very different philosophies. One reacts after the fact, the other prevents. There was also an unspoken expectation that the cattle would adjust, not the plan. That animals should accommodate human convenience. That working land should soften itself to make room for leisure. That assumption carries risk because it shifts accountability onto something that cannot consent or comply. Every time I raised these points, the response was polite but dismissive. We'll manage it. We'll coordinate. It won't be that busy. None of those statements address the core issue. You don't manage unpredictability by ignoring it. You acknowledge it and remove the conditions that cause it. I realized then that the danger wasn't just physical, it was conceptual. Once people believe land is passive, they stop listening to the people who actually work it. Expertise gets replaced with optimism. Experience gets overridden by planning software. And when something eventually goes wrong, the blame rarely lands where the decisions were made. I didn't want that. I didn't want an incident to be the thing that proved me right. I wanted the absence of one to be the point. That's a hard argument to win because success looks like nothing happening. It looks like restraint, and restraint doesn't photograph well in promotional materials. As construction plans advanced, I started documenting more than paperwork. I documented routines, daily movement, times when cattle naturally congregated near the proposed path, not to dramatize, but to show reality. This wasn't hypothetical risk. It was visible, repeatable, and entirely predictable to anyone who understood what they were looking at. I also noticed how quickly the conversation shifted once liability came up in concrete terms. Not as a threat, but as a fact. Who carries insurance? Who assumes responsibility if a cyclist panics and causes a chain reaction? Who answers when emergency services need access through a space now divided by fencing and foot traffic? These weren't rhetorical questions. They were practical ones, and they didn't have satisfying answers. Still, the HOA pressed forward, because from their perspective nothing bad had happened yet, and as long as nothing happens, warnings feel theoretical. But working land teaches you to respect what hasn't happened yet. You plan for it, you prevent it, you don't wait for proof in the form of damage. The audience watching this story might already sense where it's headed. They might already see the collision between intention and reality forming, but at that point the HOA didn't. They saw resistance as inconvenience. They saw caution as exaggeration. They saw a pasture as a park that hadn't been upgraded yet. What they didn't understand was that the land was already doing its job perfectly. Introducing foot traffic wasn't adding value, it was introducing risk, and risk doesn't announce itself loudly at first. It sits quietly, waiting for the wrong moment. This wasn't about progress versus tradition. It wasn't about refusing to share. It was about respecting the function of a place before trying to redefine it. Active land isn't a park. It doesn't pause its purpose because someone wants to pass through. And cattle don't recognize HOA boundaries. The danger was always there. The only question was who would realize it in time. At first, I believed that if I explained things clearly enough, someone would pause. That's usually how reasonable disagreements work. You raise concerns, our side listens, adjustments get made. Even when people disagree, there's an acknowledgement that the conversation itself matters. That belief lasted right up until the moment it became clear that every warning I gave wasn't slowing them down, it was encouraging them to move faster. Every objection was treated like a hurdle, not a signal. I sent formal notices outlining my concerns, calm language, no accusations, just facts. I included survey references, property boundaries, and descriptions of how the land was actively used. I explained again that the proposed route cut directly through the functional center of the pasture. I asked for a pause while the easement claim was reviewed properly. The response wasn't hostile, it was worse, it was procedural. They acknowledged receipt. They thanked me for my input, and then they continued exactly as planned. Survey flags multiplied. Contractors returned with updated drawings that somehow managed to move everything except the part that mattered. The path curved slightly, just enough for them to claim compromise, while still crossing the same critical area. When I pointed this out, the response referenced a committee vote. When I asked who was on the committee, I was told it was internal. That was the first time the imbalance became impossible to ignore. I wasn't dealing with a person, I was dealing with a structure. Emails were signed HOA board or infrastructure subcommittee. Decisions appeared fully formed, already agreed upon by people whose names I never heard spoken out loud. There was always a vote somewhere, always a meeting I hadn't been invited to, always a consensus reached without me. One landowner raising concerns versus a rotating group with letterhead and authority by default. Whenever I spoke directly to someone, they were polite, even sympathetic. I understand your frustration, one board member told me over the phone. But the community really wants this, as if wanting something hard enough transforms it into something safe or appropriate, as if majority enthusiasm overrides responsibility. What struck me most was how quickly the tone shifted from discussion to inevitability. The phrase, "this is moving forward," started appearing more often, not as a threat, just as a statement of fact, as if the outcome had already been decided, and my role was simply to adjust emotionally until I caught up. I submitted written objections through the proper channels, because that's what you're told to do. I referenced county guidelines. I included photographs showing livestock patterns. I asked for mediation. The replies became shorter, more standardized. Entire paragraphs repeated verbatim from earlier responses. It felt like talking to a system designed to absorb resistance without reacting to it. Meanwhile, activity on the land increased. More measurements, more site visits, more conversations between contractors and HOA representatives right at the fence line, conducted as if I weren't standing there. At one point, a worker asked me to move a section of temporary fencing so he could get a better look at the terrain. He didn't ask if he could, he asked when I would. That assumption said more than any meeting minutes ever could. The HOA never said, "You don't matter." They didn't need to. Their actions said it for them. They acted as though persistence alone would exhaust me, that eventually I'd decide it wasn't worth the effort to keep pushing back, that I'd trade certainty for quiet. I started to understand that this wasn't escalation born of misunderstanding. It was escalation born of confidence. They believed they were insulated by process, that if they followed their internal steps, external objections would fade into background noise. Committees are good at that. They diffuse accountability. No single person feels responsible for ignoring you because everyone is only responsible for their small part. The surveys bothered me the most, not because surveys are inherently bad, but because of how selectively they were used. I'd commissioned my own, clearly marking boundaries and usage zones. It was acknowledged, then quietly sidelined. The HOA's survey, by contrast, was treated as definitive, even though it relied on the same questionable easement claim I'd already challenged. Conflicting information wasn't resolved, it was ranked. And my input ranked lower by default. I noticed how often the word community came up in their communications. Community benefit, community access, community improvement. It was always abstract, never specific, never tied to responsibility if something went wrong. The community was invoked as a shield, not a stakeholder. I was one person, one address, one set of concerns. That made me easy to frame as an outlier, and once someone is framed that way, it becomes easier to ignore the substance of what they're saying. You stop hearing warnings and start hearing resistance. Each time I pointed out another issue, another risk, another inconsistency, the response wasn't reflection, it was acceleration. Timelines tightened, deadlines shortened. It was as if they believed speed itself would resolve the conflict, that momentum would replace legitimacy. That's when I realized something important. I wasn't being unheard, I was being outpaced intentionally. As long as the project advanced, my objections could be portrayed as reactive, as noise behind progress. The faster they moved, the harder it would be to stop without looking unreasonable. This wasn't negotiation. It was pressure. I attended one HOA meeting as an observer. I sat in the back and listened as my land was discussed without my name ever being mentioned. They referred to it as the adjacent parcel. They talked about alignment and connectivity. They spoke confidently about mitigation measures, none of which had been discussed with me directly. When someone asked if the landowner was cooperating, the answer was, "We're working through it." That phrase landed heavier than it should have. Working through it. As if I were an obstacle, not a person. After that meeting, I went home and reread every email, every letter, every response I'd received. Patterns emerged, questions answered with redirection, concerns acknowledged but not addressed, reassurance offered without substance. It was all designed to keep me engaged just enough to prevent escalation on my end, while allowing them to continue on theirs. That was the moment everything shifted. That's when I stopped asking and started documenting, not out of spite, out of clarity. If conversation wasn't going to change anything, then records would. If my voice could be minimized, then facts would have to speak instead. I stopped framing things as requests and started framing them as observations, dates, times, actions taken without consent, discrepancies between claims and reality. I documented site visits that occurred without notice. I documented changes to plans that were never communicated. I documented every instance where my formal objections were acknowledged but ignored. I kept copies of everything, organized, chronological, unemotional. Once I made that shift, the frustration eased, not because the situation improved, but because my role became clear. I wasn't there to persuade them anymore. I was there to create a record that couldn't be dismissed as opinion. The HOA continued pushing. Of course they did. From their perspective, nothing had changed. But something had. I was no longer reacting to their moves. I was observing them. And there's a big difference between someone who argues and someone who watches. They mistook my quiet for surrender. They mistook my lack of confrontation for compliance. They didn't realize that every ignored notice, every rushed decision, every assumption they made without consultation was strengthening the very case they believed they were avoiding. The imbalance of power was still there. Committees, votes, letterhead. But power leaves traces, and the more force they applied without listening, the clearer those traces became. Arrogance doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it shows up as momentum, as confidence. The T doesn't check itself, as a belief that objections are obstacles, not warnings. That's what I was watching unfold. Every warning made them push harder, and every push made the record clearer. They believed escalation would exhaust me. They didn't realize it was sharpening my focus. Up until that point, everything had been theoretical: paper versus paper, meetings versus emails, plans versus objections. It was all happening in that abstract space where people argue about what might happen, and whoever controls the timeline usually feels safest. The HOA was comfortable there. They could keep repeating that nothing had gone wrong yet, that concerns were speculative, that the project was proceeding normally. As long as the conflict lived on paper, they believed they were in control. Then the land itself forced the issue. It didn't do it loudly. It didn't do it dramatically. It didn't need to. It simply behaved the way it always had, the way it was designed to behave, without any regard for plans drawn in an office miles away. Construction had reached the point where the work crews needed to be inside the pasture for extended periods, not just surveying anymore, not just marking and measuring, but bringing in materials, staging equipment, moving back and forth throughout. The day. Temporary fencing went up in sections, not to separate cattle from people entirely, but to guide both through a space that was never meant to be shared. It was a compromise on paper. In reality, it created confusion. Cattle are pattern learners. They rely on consistency. When the environment changes slowly and predictably, they adjust. When it changes suddenly and inconsistently, they don't settle. They hesitate. Movement becomes cautious. Grouping becomes tighter. That's not aggression. It's uncertainty. And uncertainty is where problems start to form, not because something happens, but because everything becomes harder to control. I noticed it before anyone else did, because I was there every day. The herd began lingering longer near areas they usually passed through quickly. Water access shifted slightly as equipment blocked familiar paths. Normal routines stretched, small things, easy to overlook if you didn't know what normal looked like to begin with. But those small changes stacked. The crews adapted the way crews always do, on the fly. They moved materials. They adjusted schedules. They parked in different spots depending on the day. Each adjustment made sense in isolation. Together, they created a moving target for animals that depend on stability. I raised the issue again, this time not as a warning but as an observation. I noted the changes in movement. I pointed out how temporary fencing was cutting across established grazing lanes. I suggested a pause, even a short one, to reassess how the work was interacting with the land in real time, not just on plans. The response was familiar, acknowledged, thanked, filed, work continued. The first real consequence didn't come from a dramatic incident, it came from interruption. One morning the crews didn't start on time. Equipment sat idle. Phones rang more than engines. There was a noticeable shift in tone, less confidence, more coordination. Something had happened that required discussion before proceeding, and discussion wasn't part of the original plan. I didn't hear details right away. I wasn't meant to. But patterns speak. When supervisors show up unexpectedly, when work pauses without explanation, when a project that's been rushing suddenly hesitates, it means someone, somewhere, has asked a question that doesn't have an easy answer. By midday, I saw vehicles I hadn't seen before. Not county trucks yet, but not contractors either. People walking the site without tools, pointing, taking notes, standing still for long stretches, watching. That's when I knew the situation had shifted from planned to observed. The HOA representatives were there too, though they kept their distance from me. They spoke in lower voices. They gestured more than usual. The easy certainty that had defined every previous interaction was gone. In its place was calculation. Later, I learned that an issue had been flagged internally, not a crisis, not an accident, an exposure. Someone had cared how liability was being handled, now that the project was physically intersecting with active livestock, not in theory, in practice. How coverage applied when conditions changed daily, how risk was assessed when plans met reality. Those are uncomfortable questions because they don't accept optimistic answers. Insurance doesn't care about intent, it cares about probability, and probability had just changed. The project slowed further. Temporary fencing was adjusted again, this time more conservatively. Work windows shortened. Crews were instructed to avoid certain areas at certain times of day. All of this happened quietly, without announcement. But the message was clear: the land was no longer cooperating with the schedule. What the HOA had framed as a simple amenity was now a variable environment that required constant monitoring. The cost wasn't just financial, it was mental. Every adjustment introduced another point of failure, another scenario that had to be accounted for. The confidence that had driven escalation began to erode, replaced by caution. I didn't celebrate that shift. I didn't comment on it publicly. I watched, because the most telling moment wasn't the slowdown, it was the meeting that followed. An emergency session was added to the HOA calendar with little notice. Not advertised widely, not positioned as a decision-making event, just logistics. That alone was unusual. Projects that are truly on track don't need emergency logistics meetings in middle of execution. I wasn't invited, but the effects were visible almost immediately afterward. Communications changed tone. Language became less absolute. Phrases like pending review and temporary pause started appearing where moving forward had once been the default. The land hadn't caused harm. It hadn't created a scene. It had simply refused to behave like a park. That refusal was enough. The real turning point came when work stopped entirely for a full day. No equipment, no crews, just quiet. Quiet in a way that felt intentional, not incidental. That kind of pause doesn't happen unless someone higher up has said, "We need to look at this again." I later found out that the pause wasn't voluntary. It was precautionary. A recommendation, not an order, but one that carried weight. When people who assess risk for a living start using words like exposure and uncontrolled variables, momentum tends to slow on its own. The HOA had believed they could manage around the land. They were now discovering that the land dictated the terms, whether they acknowledged it or not. It wasn't dramatic enough to make headlines. It didn't need to be. It was the kind of moment where confidence quietly drains away, replaced by doubt. The kind of moment where everyone involved starts imagining how this could look if it went wrong, and how those imaginations would sound under oath. That's when phone calls started getting returned more quickly. That's when questions I'd been asked for months suddenly felt relevant. That's when my documentation, once politely ignored, became something people asked to see. The shift wasn't immediate, but it was irreversible. The project had crossed a line, from theoretical compatibility to real-world interaction. And in that interaction, the assumptions holding it together began to fail. The pasture hadn't changed, the cattle hadn't changed, the routines hadn't changed. The only thing that had changed was the realization that plans drawn without understanding don't override reality. They collide with it. By the end of that week, the tone had fully shifted from confidence to caution, from inevitability to uncertainty, from speed to pause. The HOA didn't announce a retreat. They didn't admit error, but they no longer acted like this was settled. And once that happened, the situation moved out of their hands. Because when uncertainty enters a project that affects land use, safety, and liability, it doesn't stay internal for long. Questions get escalated, files get reviewed, outside eyes get involved. That's when the county got involved. Once inspectors showed up, everything unraveled. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in the steady, methodical way systems do when they're given clear information and time to work. There were no raised voices, no public confrontations, no speeches, just clipboards, questions, and a sudden shift in who was answering to whom. The first visit was quiet. 2 county vehicles pulled up near the access road early in the morning before any construction crews arrived. The inspectors walked the site slowly, not looking at renderings or proposals, but at the ground itself. They took measurements where temporary fencing cut across grazing lanes. They noted where equipment staging overlapped with livestock movement. They asked when work had begun and under what authorization. Simple questions, the kind that don't accuse but don't assume either. The HOA representatives arrived later, visibly unprepared for the tone of the conversation. They brought binders and printed plans, confident in the idea that paperwork would carry the day. For months it had. This time, the inspectors didn't start with the plans. They started with permits. Which permits covered construction inside an active agricultural operation? Which approvals addressed mixed-use safety? Which filings disclosed the presence of livestock? The answers were hesitant. Some permits referenced recreational infrastructure. Others referenced utility access. None of them described what was actually happening on the ground. That gap mattered. Permits aren't about intent, they're about scope. If the scope doesn't match reality, the permit doesn't protect you, and once that mismatch was identified, the entire project began to wobble. The inspectors asked for the easement documentation next, not copies, records, recording numbers, filing dates, verification. The same questions I'd been asking for months, now asked by people whose job was to verify, not negotiate. The responses were the same as before: explanations, assurances, references to long-standing agreements. This time, those answers didn't move the conversation forward. The inspectors took notes and said they'd follow up with the county records office directly. That was the moment I saw something change in the HOA's posture. For the first time, they weren't framing the situation as a disagreement. They were reacting to scrutiny. There's a difference. Disagreements can be managed internally. Scrutiny can't. Over the next few days, the site remained quiet. No crews, no equipment, just flags in the ground and temporary fencing that now felt less like progress and more like evidence. Inspectors returned, sometimes alone, sometimes with specialists. Each visit focused on a different layer of the project: land use classification, safety compliance, environmental disclosure, liability coverage. The picture that emerged wasn't one of malice. It was one of overreach built on assumption. The HOA had treated the pasture as if it were undeveloped land waiting for purpose, rather than active agricultural property with existing protections and obligations. That assumption had shaped everything that followed. Permits sought under the wrong categories, safety plans that addressed pedestrians but not livestock, insurance policies that didn't account for daily operational risk. And then there was the easement. When the county confirmed there was no valid recorded easement matching the document the HOA had relied on, the foundation disappeared entirely. Without that authority, the project wasn't just flawed, it was unauthorized. Everything that had been justified by that single piece of paper lost its footing. The response wasn't panic, it was process. Stop work notices were issued, not as punishment, but as protocol. Reviews were opened, communications shifted from internal emails to formal correspondence. The HOA's legal counsel became more visible, but also more cautious. Statements that had once been confident became conditional, pending review, subject to verification. Language tightened as certainty evaporated. I was asked to provide my documentation, not because anyone suddenly trusted me more, but because the record I'd kept aligned with what inspectors were seeing on the ground. Dates matched, descriptions matched, patterns emerged. When evidence is consistent, it becomes useful. What struck me during this phase was how unemotional the entire process was. There was no sense of victory or defeat in the way things unfolded, just alignment. Once facts were established, outcomes followed naturally. That's how systems are supposed to work. The HOA attempted to reframe the project, suggesting reroutes, temporary solutions, shared responsibilities. Each proposal ran into the same problem. Without authority to cross the pasture, there was nothing to revise. The question wasn't how to build, it was whether they could build at all. They couldn't. Meetings were held, notices were sent, residents asked questions. The narrative shifted from delayed improvement to misrepresentation, not in an accusatory way, but in a factual one. Plans had been presented as settled when they were not. Assurances had been given without verification. The community wasn't angry so much as surprised. I didn't attend most of those meetings. There was nothing for me to argue anymore. The issue had moved beyond persuasion. It lived in reports and findings now, where personal dynamics don't carry much weight. Eventually, the decision was communicated plainly. The project could not proceed as planned. Any future proposal would require valid authority, appropriate permits, and a design that did not interfere with active agricultural use. In other words, it would require starting over, with reality included this time. The construction equipment was removed quietly, stakes pulled, temporary fencing dismantled. The pasture returned to its familiar rhythm as if it had simply waited out an interruption. There was no announcement, no apology, just absence. I stood at the fence line the morning the last truck left and felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, relief. The kind that comes when something that never should have happened finally stops. The HOA didn't collapse. The community didn't fracture. Life went on. But something important had shifted. Assumptions had been corrected. Authority had been clarified. The idea that paperwork alone could override lived reality had been tested and failed. People sometimes expect stories like this to end with confrontation or punishment. This one didn't. It ended with alignment, with systems doing what they're designed to do when they're given accurate information, with due process, not drama, and in the end, the outcome was simple and unmistakable. The bike path stopped exactly where my pasture began. After everything settled, after the inspectors stopped coming, and the letters stopped arriving, the land went back to doing what it had always done. Grass grew, fences held. The herd moved in familiar patterns, unbothered by the brief interruption. If you didn't know what had almost happened, you'd never guess there had been a plan to change it. That quiet return to normal is what stayed with me the most, because it highlighted something that often gets lost in these conflicts. Rural land isn't aesthetic, it's operational. That pasture was never empty, even when it looked calm. It was always working, always responding to seasons, weather, and routine. The conflict didn't start because someone wanted to ride a bike. It started because people mistook function for absence. They saw open space and assumed availability. They saw quiet and assumed consent. That mistake isn't unique to one HOA or one county. It happens everywhere rural and suburban worlds meet. Across the country, development presses up against land that still produces food, manages water, supports wildlife, and sustains families. Those places don't announce their purpose loudly. They don't have signs explaining their daily operations. They rely on understanding that used to be common and is now increasingly rare. When that understanding fades, friction fills the gap. What struck me in the aftermath wasn't anger from either side. It was confusion. Many residents genuinely hadn't known the land was active in the way it was. They'd driven past it for years without ever asking what happened there day to day. That wasn't malice, it was distance, a growing disconnect between how land looks and what land does. That disconnect is where problems begin. When land is treated as scenery instead of infrastructure, decisions get made without the right questions being asked. Planners focus on access but not impact. Committees vote on amenities without understanding obligations. Conversations happen in meeting rooms instead of at fence lines. By the time reality pushes back, everyone is surprised, even though the signs were always there. Respect doesn't require agreement, it requires curiosity. The simple act of asking how a piece of land functions can prevent years of conflict. Communication isn't a courtesy in these situations, it's a necessity. When it's missing, assumptions rush in to fill the space. Land use literacy matters more now than ever. As communities expand and boundaries blur, more people live next to operations they don't recognize as operations. Farms, ranches, managed forests, working waterways, all of them carry rhythms and risks that don't disappear because a neighborhood grows nearby. Ignoring that doesn't modernize a place. It destabilizes it. What this experience reinforced for me is that coexistence isn't passive, it takes intent. It takes listening before planning, not after. It takes acknowledging that some spaces already serve a purpose, even if that purpose isn't immediately visible or convenient. The system worked in the end, not because anyone won, but because evidence was allowed to matter. Once facts replaced assumptions, the path forward became obvious. That outcome wasn't dramatic, but it was durable. It left the land intact and the community wiser, which is more valuable than any short-term amenity. I didn't come away from this thinking HOAs are inherently bad or that development is inherently wrong. I came away understanding how fragile understanding has become, how easily good intentions can override practical knowledge, and how quickly things go wrong when land is spoken about more than it's listened to. If you live near agricultural land, this matters more than you think, not because conflict is inevitable, but because prevention is quiet. The best outcomes are the ones that never turn into stories at all. They happen when people slow down, ask questions, and recognize that open land isn't waiting to be improved, it's already doing its job. That pasture still looks the same if you drive by. Wide, green, unassuming. But now, when I stand at the fence line, I see more than grass and cattle. I see a reminder that function doesn't always announce itself, and that respecting what we don't immediately understand is often the difference between harmony and conflict. Some lessons do not need a dramatic ending to last. They just need to be noticed